Hi, Gary Zacharias with the Apologist bookshelf. I'm taking another look at one of my favorite people, J. Warner Wallace. His book is God's Crime Scene, looking for evidence that there's a divinely created universe out there. He's also the author of Cold Case Christianity. So I've done two previous podcasts on his dealing with mind versus brain. In other words, do we have a mind or we just meat? And then one of his other chapters was on the fine-tuning that goes on in the universe. Well, this one, I wanted to focus on chapter 3. It's the origin of life. So he's subtitled as the text, like the universe in this case, require an author. So he starts off asking a question at the beginning, what is life? And he spends some time on that. I'm going to skip over that. But he moves to the complexity of life when you get down to the cellular level. And he says it's just mind-boggling to think about cells. They need to metabolize, and they need to reproduce, and incredibly complicated and how difficult it is to try to figure out how that happened. He says scientists have tried to explain the origin of life to try to figure out a sequence. There has to be a sequence of events that lead to primitive cells. So you've got to start off with carbon atoms, and then you've got to get amino acids and nucleotide bases, and you've got to get proteins, and you got to get amino acids entirely right-handed or left-handed. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But just the difficulty, you have to have these chains for amino acids to form into useful protein shapes. And of course, the proteins do all the heavy lifting inside of us, and just how hard it is. And he said, then you got to get DNA. Said nucleotides, right? These are chunks of, I guess you'd say, nucleotides have to form from a combination of bases. That's phosphates and sugars and things like that. So they have to join together in long chains. They're called nucleic acids. And of course, we know deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, and that's the largest molecule that's known. It has as many as 10 billion atoms that make it up. And what you have are 4 different bases in DNA, chemical bases: adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. And they have to go in a particular order, and that forms a genetic code at A, G, C, and T. And when you pull DNA apart, then you can see the A, T, C, and G, and you can figure out to read it, and it's like computer code. So it says, all right, what else do you have to have for primitive cells? Remember, he's just talking about how you get cells together. So you've got to have all that nucleic acid material. You've got to get DNA and RNA. But he said, if you want to protect these machines that are required for life, the cells have got to have membranes and cell walls. That's going to protect everything on the inside from harm while it filters things that they need inside the cell. Well, that's incredibly complicated as well. So he spends time talking about that. He said you got all this protein formation going on inside the cell, and certain proteins will zip apart DNA. You know, it's like a ladder that's twisted together. And when you pull it apart, those rungs, of course, are that A, C, G, T that you can read. And you're getting instructions based on that to build proteins. So it says, rather than remaining in a long chain, the amino acids begin to roll up and they fold into each other to become these proteins. It says enzymes then are large molecules made up with proteins. So now you need enzymes for the formation, but here's the catch. You need enzymes to form proteins, but the enzymes are built with proteins. So what do they call that? A chicken and the egg problem. So how do you do that? You got proteins that are required to create machines, but the machines inside our cells are required to create proteins. Wow. So he quotes Paul Davies, who's not a Christian, and I think it's important to just listen to what he has to say. He says, take DNA. It has a grand agenda, but to implement this, DNA must enlist the help of proteins. Proteins are made by complicated machines called ribosomes, according to coded instruction that you get in DNA via messenger RNA. The problem is, and here it comes, this is Paul Davies still, how could proteins get made without the DNA code for them? The mRNA to transcribe the instructions and the ribosomes to assemble them. But if the proteins are not already there, how can DNA, ribosomes, and all the rest of the paraphernalia get made in the first place? He calls it catch-22. So all of this stuff that's going on, all these machines and transportation vehicles and all these tools have to arrive at the cellular factory simultaneously and function in unison if you're going to get life uh, originated and get life possible. So in the next section he says, so where could all of this have happened? Maybe in the atmosphere. And they had that famous experiment in the 1950s that he points out, Miller-Urey, and they tried to mix different ammonia, methane, water vapors, and all this kind of stuff, pass an electric charge through the gases, and they did find some amino acids. And they were so excited. There we go. That's how you get the basic building blocks of life. Maybe that formed naturally in the atmosphere of the early Earth. Well, now we have evidence that those gases that they used were not present in the quantity or the proportion they used. And it says scientists now believe the early Earth atmosphere could not produce amino acids the way you needed them. Well, what about this? How about an ancient primordial soup? So that's seen in a lot of entry-level biology textbooks. Here's the catch. We don't have any physical evidence to support the existence of a primordial soup. Oops, there that goes. But what about land? Could maybe life started on land? Well, here's the problem. It's that scientists have realized the impossibility of stabilizing the environment to have the right cells coming along. Says they can't do it. Well, maybe in the earth, maybe underground. But says underground locations in the early earth would have been hostile to the formation of biochemical precursors. How about space? Maybe it started in space. Maybe, for example, the basic building blocks for life, like amino acids, maybe they got delivered to Earth in a meteorite. Yeah, but how would those simple molecules form into more complex proteins and nucleic acids that you need for life? We're back to that chicken and egg problem. Well, and then there's a big question. How'd they originate out in space? How'd they survive the entry into the planet's atmosphere? All right, so there's the question of how. Nobody has any idea. Here's another classic question he challenges. So we did the where did life originate? We don't know. Here's another question. When did this happen? People say, well, you got 4 billion years. You got the Earth here for a long time. He said, wait. He said, scientists are trying to figure out the origin of life. They concede that the early Earth was not hospitable to life's formation. There were sterilization events, they say. The Earth got bombarded by asteroids and meteorites. So then, after all of that terrible damage and devastation to the Earth, scientists have discovered life emerged quickly. We don't have billions of years. It's like the Earth was not able to have life. It was sterile. It was wiped out, mashed up pretty good. And then bingo, then you've got life. So it says they're really stuck trying to explain how this complexity emerges in such a short time period. Now, he moves to another question. Okay, why did it happen? Says before Darwinian evolution could ever do its work, some degree of complexity had been required. But he said, the more we learn about the complexity of just the basic forms of life and all that stuff about DNA and RNA and the proteins, he said the less researchers believe chance could account for all this wonderful existence. It looks so orchestrated. It looks like cooperation came about. So maybe they self-organized. Is that possible? The molecules and the structures? But it said the research in this area has reached what's called a stalemate. So it said, how were these instructions written inside these machines and the tools they were instructed to do? So how's that possible? Well, what's going on here? He's talking about there's information inside the cells, information. And so he says DNA has those sequences. It's information. And where do you get information? From a mind. He again quotes Paul Davies. He said, once this essential point is grasped, talking about nucleotide sequencing and DNA, he said, once this essential point is grasped, the real problem of biogenesis is clear. Since the heady successes of molecular biology, most investigators have sought the secret of life in the physics and chemistry of molecules. But Davies says they will look in vain for conventional physics and chemistry to explain life. He said that's a classic case of confusing the medium with the message. The secret lies, he says, again, this is Davies, not in its chemical basis, but in the logical and informational rules it exploits. There you are again. He said if you look at those sequences, as you pull apart DNA and you read that CTG, so on, says that's not statistical gibberish. They're semantically, pragmatically, and put together significant sources of information. that sequence has meaning and it directs action to be taken for a specific purpose. So where do you get information? Says, well, every geographic location proposed, for the start of life, that required an explanation for the existence of information in the code. Every time frame offered for when life got going, that requires an explanation for that DNA information. Even the why of why life emerges, that we go back to need for information. So he said, you've got to have an explanation for this information, and he ends up saying it's intelligence. That's the best explanation. But of course, that makes us have to look for a source that goes beyond the physical universe, doesn't it? So he quotes, let's see, this is a biochemistry and molecular biology teacher at Colorado State University. He said, the origin of life appears to me as incomprehensible as ever, a matter for wonder, but not for explication. Wow. So that's incredible. That's just one of his chapters that's good. If I have enough time, if that's okay, maybe I'll tackle one more chapter. I've done 5. Let's do chapter 6, which is on free will. Okay, so is that all right if we do another chapter? You got enough time? Yeah. So chapter 6. Do we have choices in this universe? Is there free will? Isn't that weird? People argue about free will. So if we have a material universe, just the stuff around us, it's all determined. And that free will would just be an illusion, right? I mean, if it's all chemistry, then where's there room for free will? There isn't any. So if all our actions are dictated by prior physical events, then we're not morally good or we're not morally bad. I mean, if determinism is true, even our future is fixed and predetermined. So if we go around praising people or blaming people for things, that seems silly. Even efforts at justice are pointless. In fact, he said the Supreme Court rejected determinism at one time and cited free will as the foundation of our legal system. Well, of course it is. But I mean, think about that. If determinism is true, if we're just wired, if we just have chemicals sloshing around in us and our brains or neurons are firing, that's determinism, then our physical past and the laws of nature are really the only reasons why we do what we do. So he says, how do we reconcile this materialistic view of nature with our own experience? We really feel that we have free will and we have responsibility. So he said, well, some people try to reconcile free will with determinism. So how is that possible? But some people say, well, maybe free will just kind of emerged from a deterministic universe. So how could that happen? There's no evidence to support this. So emergence has actually been thrown away by neuroscientists. So what's going on here? Do we have free will or not? That's a huge issue. So should we reject the importance of free will? Right? It's just an illusion. He says, well, if determinists are going to say that free will is an illusion, they need some evidence rather than just their philosophy and their presupposition. He said, think about this. If those who commit crimes don't really have the freedom to change, then there's no such thing as rehabilitation. Yeah. He says, for the determinists, the only kind of causation in the universe is insight. It's just events cause things. Right? But people are agents. They can act as first causes. So that's called agent causation. That's our experience as humans. Right? We feel we're really starting things, getting things going. They said, look around us. We praise, we blame people for their actions. Why do we do that? So I said, if you look at courts, they recognize the role of the non-material mind. They recognize free will of defendants. Excuse me. So yeah, we see this all the time. Moral responsibility. I mean, free will is difficult to deny, isn't it? Unless, of course, you have the freedom to deny it. Well, there's freedom as well. So we've got all these things going on here that make us think, there's got to be free will in this universe. So I hope this gives you just kind of a quick view of what J. Warner Wallace is up to with this God's crime scene. I mean, I haven't done it justice because there's so many good chapters, and I'll come back to it again. It's heady. I mean, you got to think about it. But wonderful stuff in here. Things on law and order. What about morality? Is that an opinion? What about God and evil? So there are other really good chapters that we'll get into later on. God's Crime Scene, J. Warner Wallace. Take a look at his material, coldcasechristianity.com. Lots of good YouTube videos as well. Excellent person. Hope someday you could have him come to your church or group and give a talk. He's come to our church a couple of times. Does an excellent job. Warm, witty, wonderful person. All right, well, thanks for being part of this podcast.